You know, we have a tremendous program for the young people of God's church. It is a program that's designed to support and to add to the training that they receive in the home. We're not trying to take the place of the home. In fact, this year, when you look at our young people, and I don't know whether you realize it or not, we have 26,000 kids attending God's Feast in the United States this year. And they will give, during the course of the Feast of Tabernacles, $50,000. And so we are only now beginning to really realize the importance of the valuable resource in God's church of the youth. Do you realize that over a 5-year period, brethren, that we could see 7,500 new members added to God's church just from our YOU programs? And I think that's very, very realistic. And so we see why God is beginning to emphasize in His church this vast reservoir of His church, the youth. And so we have today Youth Day. And it's being observed all around the world in God's church during this festival to imprint in all of our minds the importance of the youth of God's church and to give our youth also a direct part in serving in God's church. And this is particularly important since Jesus Christ is beginning to reveal to His church the fact that the youth of God's church are not cut off from God. And so this sermon I'm going to give you today on the subject of youth of God's church is to the youth for that very purpose. But you know, you could scarcely talk about the subject of youth without speaking to the parents and the members of God's church. And so, to begin this sermon, I want to speak to the parents and members of God's church first. Members because you affect the young people of God's church, but both because you are so tied to the youth of the church. And I want the youth also to listen, because one day you're going to be in their places. You're going to be exactly right there in their same place. And so I want all of you to listen to the words of a song that I think are very poignant for this church at this particular time, and it seems to tie into Youth Day. It was a song that was very popular back in 1976, written by a man who was very popular again in the musical field, Harry Chapin. He wrote a song called Cat in the Cradle. And so I'm going to have them play that for you. And I don't want you to, again, listen to the music. I want you to listen to the words. And so I'm going to have them play that for you right now.
A child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking for I knew it, and as he grew, he'd say, I'm gonna be like you, Dad, you know I'm gonna be like you. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then. You know we'll have a good time then. My son turned 10 just the other day. He said, thanks for the ball, Dad, come on, let's play. Can you teach me to throw? I said, not today, I got a lot to do. He said, that's okay. And then he walked away, but his smile never shifted. Said, I'm gonna be like him. Yeah, you know I'm gonna be like him. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, the little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then. You know we'll have a good time then. Well, he came from college just the other day, so much like a man I just had to say, son, I'm proud of you. Can you sit for a while? He shook his head and then said with a smile, what I'd really like, Dad, is to borrow the car keys. See you later, can I have them, please? And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad. You know we'll have a good I've long since retired, my son's moved away. I called him up just the other day. I said, I'd like to see you if you don't mind. He said, I'd love to, Dad, if I can find the time. You see, my new job's a hassle and the kids are the flu, but it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And the cat's in the cradle and still the spoon. Little boy blue and the man on the phone. When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad. We're gonna have a good time there.
You know, that's a song, when you hear the music, you want to tap your foot. But when you listen to the words, it just about makes you cry. He says a child arrived just the other day. I identify with that because I just had a little boy. He says there were bills to play and also planes to catch. He learned to walk while I was away. We'll be coming home soon, Dad. He said, well, I'd like to, but I don't have time, and we'll have a good time, though, when I come home. He turned 10 the other day. His dad gave him a ball, and he said, well, could you teach me to throw the ball? He said, well, I can't. I'm busy. That's okay, the little boy said. We'll get together then, and we'll have a good time then. And so the dad says to the son, after he comes home from college, he says, he's just such a man. He says, can you sit and talk for a while? He said, Dad, I'd like to, but could I have the keys, and I'll see you later, and we'll have a good time then. And then his father retired, and he called his son up to spend some time with him. And his son said, Dad, I'd really like to, but you see, the new job's a hassle and the kids have the flu, but it's sure nice talking to you. But we'll have a good time then. And it occurred to the father that his son had grown up just like him. It is a terrible, vicious cycle of life. How did you grow up, brethren? And how do you want your children to grow up? Just like you? Is that what you want? To go through the terrible hard knocks? They call it the University of Hard Knocks. Do we ever wonder, brethren, in God's church, why the youth of today, not just the youth in the church of God, but the youth in the entire world for that matter, but let's focus in on the church. Why the youth in God's church are the way that they are. They're faced with a dilemma. Because the youth are particularly at this time torn between a rock and a hard place in their lives. A terrible dilemma. On the one side, it's kind of the Harry Chapin tape all over again. Life on the home front doesn't offer too much to them. Dad works, and they know he has to work. He has his hobbies. Maybe he plays golf, or he works in the shop, or whatever. Mom, now, today, she has a job. And she may even double as a wife. And so on the one side, they see this on the home front, and then on the other side, they see the youth of the world, again, seeing themselves and being excited about the glittering lights of society that seem to stare them in the face like a vast neon sign. And that sign says, do your own thing, very loud. And on top of that, our modern advertising enterprise promotes the mudslide, this mudslide, by encouraging our young people to, and everyone for that matter, to search for freedom, to find individuality. You know, society says that freedom, individuality, and finding oneself is attained by being disobedient. By being disobedient, you become a free man, an individual, so to speak. You know, I heard a story about a fellow that went to go find himself, but he got lost. And there are a lot of people that are lost in the world. They really are. They don't know where they're going. We have a popular contemporary social philosopher. His name is Eric Fromm. And this is what is taught, by the way, brethren, in the universities of our land, and it has a very strong and powerful impact on higher education. Eric Fromm says this: human history begins with man's act of disobedience. Now, he's not far from being wrong about that, by the way, because who rebelled against God? Well, Lucifer did. He became Satan. Who rebelled against God in the beginning? Well, Adam and Eve. They were disobedient against God. And so, he's true about this. He says, man's history begins with an act of disobedience, which at that very time, now here's where he jumps the track, the beginning of his freedom begins. His freedom begins with disobedience. And then he adds a little blurb at the end, and the development of reason. That it is a reasonable thing to rebel. And of course we've realized during the course of this feast that rebellion doesn't get you anything. God has seen the effect of rebellion and what rebellion can do. It has destroyed vast areas of this universe. And we see again the destruction that came about because of rebellion. And so this is the way society feels. So disobedience, they say, leads to freedom. And this is the teaching of the world and our universities today. And I'm really thankful that Ambassador College has something else to say in a world that is a wilderness of true knowledge. And so we see that rebellion is the way of the world. And so our young people, this is the dilemma they have. On the one account, they see the excitement, the bright lights, with a no promise of tomorrow, because society doesn't promise you tomorrow, by the way. It's eat, drink, and be merry, and tomorrow you may die, basically. And on the other side, it's the turned off, oftentimes tuned out family life, with too many people in that family doing their own thing. You know, mom doing something, dad doing something, and virtually never having time to spare with our youth. And all too often, it is that way within God's church. And if you had a choice between those two, which one would you choose? I know which one you would choose. I know what you would choose. You know, we had a proverb, I guess, that we quoted quite often, and I think that we understood it a different way in God's church, and thankfully now we have a balance about it. You know the proverb that says, train up a child, and some people thought, though many didn't, I'll add that it said, spank up a child. A lot of people thought that, by the way. If you spank up a child in the way he should go, when he is older, he won't leave the church. Now, we found that doesn't work, haven't we? Now, many didn't realize, then I'll add as a blurb, many did realize that discipline can be given in many ways and forms. Spanking is a way that is definitely a way of getting to the attention of a young person, by the way. It's amazing how a swat on the posterior will suddenly grab a child's attention. You know, just a swat like that. It's like I heard a story one time about a little boy who was going into his grandfather's blacksmith shop, and his dad had put a horseshoe he had just stuck in the coals on an anvil. It was hot. And the little boy came in, and he went over the horseshoe and, picked that horseshoe up and slapped it down like that. His dad or his grandfather chuckled under his breath, and he said, "What's the matter? Is it too hot for you?" He said, "No, Dad, or grandfather, it doesn't take me very long to look at a horseshoe." So, it's kind of that way. If you get a swat on the posterior, it really grabs their attention. But of course, having discipline such as that has to also have the positive instruction right along with it. Well, let's go to this proverb over in Proverbs, the 22nd chapter. If you will, turn there with me. In Proverbs, the 22nd chapter, in verse 6, and let's read it for what it says. And again, there are a lot of scriptures I could turn to that tell us that, again, spanking is a discipline. That's something that you can use as a tool. Proverbs, the 22nd chapter. But I wonder if it would not be a good time for fathers to examine themselves. With this thought in mind, I look back over the years and I think of all my shortcomings as a father. And I think of the times of your birth and of our years of growing up to maturity. It all went so quickly. You're all gone and on your own before I really could realize it. Why must a man wait until he's old to realize the treasures he has? How much greater it would be if he could realize these treasures, miracles, earlier in life. It's been really wonderful watching you kids grow up and developing into fine, God-fearing adults, maybe even in spite of me. But I do thank God for every one of you. But again, I think of how much greater it might have been had I the knowledge then that I have now. We, your mother and I, would have spent so much more time together with you and gotten to know each other so much better. I could have helped you more in your tests and your trials. I could have instilled in you the thrill and the privilege of being a parent, and on it goes. These are very serious thoughts to me, and tears come to my eyes as I write. Maybe my writing will help all of you to realize the treasures you have now. He says, in closing, count your blessings and God bless you. Love, Dad. He realized that he really didn't appreciate his children the way he should, to the magnitude that he should, when he had them. And so you really don't appreciate something until it's gone. You know, during the Feast of Tabernacles, I think it's especially important that we stress the family, because God is now revealing in our time to His church that the youth are not cut off from God, that they have the door wide open, so to speak, and this truth, brethren, has to be implemented in God's church. Now that we understand 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, verse 14, as Mr. Armstrong has written to us about it, we need to implement it within God's church, and it is a tremendous responsibility that we have with this new truth that we have. We have got to apply it within God's church. We have got to apply it with the youth of God's church. And it is a heavy responsibility upon the parents of those children. And it's also a very heavy responsibility on the youth of God's church, because they have got to obey God and His truth, what He says to them. But you know, that responsibility is a twofold responsibility, for parents and for youth. But the responsibility is not later, by the way, brethren. We may not have a later, by the way. It is now. I want you to turn to Malachi, the 4th chapter. I know that many of you have again gone over these scriptures many, many times. But again, with reference to what we're talking about, I don't think that you could really give a sermon about young people and about the family and about child and parent relationships without turning to Malachi, the 4th chapter. In verse 5, it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Eternal." This is the work of Elijah, brethren. We've been told that many, many years in God's church. This is the work of Elijah. And we need to realize again what God is saying to this church at this time about children. And of course there's another religion that's starting to emphasize children too, by the way. Interesting counterfeit, huh? Interesting counterfeit, because this is the only viable plan that is going to work. Because their plan won't work. Ours will. Because God is behind us. Verse 6, "And He shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with utter destruction." He says you're going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. And not the other way around, by the way. Even though the children's hearts will be turned to the fathers in due time. The fathers are the first ones that are mentioned. The fathers, brethren, that are taking the role in the home the way that they should, of being the head of the house, and their wives, again, being submissive as a part of that family. It's going to take an awful lot of work, but the family, the parents, the father taking the first step, because they are the converted and the pliable ones. Are you converted and are you pliable, brethren? Are you able to be molded and shaped in God's church? You know, Mr. Armstrong has continued to tell us that we need to grow in understanding, in grace and knowledge. And, sometimes we can come to a point and just plain stop. We need to be pliable, brethren. And God needs to be able to work with us. And you should be the one, fathers, to take the first step toward your children. Just like God did with you when He began to call you. He began to spend time with you. God the Father and Jesus Christ again. very much involved with you when you were called. And so you're going to have to take the first step to implement some of these programs, and God is going to hold you accountable and responsible. Over in Luke the 15th chapter, so God tells us that the fathers are the ones that are going to have to really bear down and have to produce some fruit. Luke the 15th chapter and verse 11. You know the proverbial prodigal son chapter, and it talks about two sons. Oftentimes we only emphasize the prodigal son. Now I'm going to emphasize the other son in this sermon today. But in verse 11 it says that he said, a certain man had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. And he divided unto him his living. He didn't argue with him. He just gave it to him. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and he took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. Now, there are a lot of young people that you can see as you go along the highways. They've got their backpacks on. They're going to discover the world. And of course, it's very sad what happens to some of those young people. But, he was going to go out and conquer the world because the world was at his feet. He was going to be able to do that because, you see, he was different than every other young person that ever took to the trails of highways. He was different. Verse 13, or verse 14. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and he joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. Now, really, he has conquered the world now, hasn't he? It's like, in verse 16, it says that he would have eaten, corn husks, if he could have. Many of you probably heard of the book that is entitled, If the world is full of cherries, or if life is the cherries, or whatever, then what am I doing in the pits? By Herbert. I don't know exactly how it goes. I guess he thought, well, if life is a bowl of cherries, then what am I doing with the pigs? He may have come to himself in just that way. I don't know whether Irma was there at the time, but at any rate, he came to a startling realization. In a sense, he was changed. Converted, I guess you would say. Verse 18, he says, I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and am no more worthy to be called your son. So he went through a change, so to speak. And so he arose, and he came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him. He ran to him. He fell on his neck with compassion, and he said, You dirty rat! Is that what it says? I don't think so. I'm not James Cagney, but, I don't know. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion. And he ran and he fell on his neck and he kissed him. He didn't go to his son and say, well, son, I told you so. Because the son already knew that his dad was right. He already knew that. And he knew that, again, his son had learned his lesson. Oftentimes, brethren, we can come in and we can try to correct in situations, and we try to take the part of God, to change someone inside. Did you kind of work it up inside of you when you came to want to be a part of God's church, and then you change yourself? Did you do that? Well, if you did, you're really not converted. Because God changed you. And so, brethren, let's let God do His work in changing young people that have problems such as that. Now, this fellow was a rebel, and he had to deal with him in a gentle manner. So if you have a problem such as that, you can help him to see himself, but do it gently. Try to come down to his level, to entreat him, just as the Father did right here. To entreat him. Don't say, I told you so, because he already knows that. And be the kind of a parent that extends his hand to help someone up. Life is kind of like a ladder. You probably had a lot of symbolism that people talk about, but life is kind of like a ladder. You kind of climb up in life. And, you don't go down, by the way. A father doesn't go down and say, son, I'm going to just push you up this ladder. You ever see anybody trying to push somebody up the ladder? Kind of awkward, isn't it? Well, extending a hand is a little bit easier. Helping that person come up is a lot easier. So don't go down to push him up. Go down to extend a hand. And I want you to notice here in chapter 15 that the father, again, is the one that does the entreating. You know, some fathers say, well, you know, I'm really too old to do that kind of thing. You know, don't ask me to belittle myself or whatever. You know, some people really are too proud, even before their own children. Well, we shouldn't be that way. Of course, in the account here as well, the other son, by the way, though the prodigal son is the most, I guess, profound for us, the other son is the one that received the inheritance. He was one that got the inheritance. And that is the kind of sons and daughters that our youth of God's church ought to be. They ought to be the faithful ones. They ought to be the diligent ones. But in cases such as the prodigal son, then we've got to give a helping hand. We've got to help out some way. But the rebel son did get the attention. That's the point. He got the attention, by the way, but he didn't get the inheritance. Now the other son that got the inheritance might have been called a square in today's world. I remember someone talking about Liberace one time, how they were laughing. You know, he's the piano player. Liberace wearing the diamonds and so forth. And I don't put any stamp of approval on the way he dresses or anything like that. But someone asked him one time, he says, you know, what do you think about these people laughing at you, wearing these diamonds and all that all over you? And he said, yeah, he says, I'm laughing right along with them all the way to the bank. You know, and that's the son that was faithful, by the way. That is the one that is going to receive the inheritance. And remember also, the rebel son served his brother. He served his brother. Now, some of our youth today are like the rebel son. Because, you see, the youth of today are like they were yesterday. They crave attention from anyone. And if they do not get normal attention from their parents, then they will do almost anything to get that attention. It's like a youth I knew. His name was Danny. He said, I don't want to be a rebel, but I find myself doing it sometime just to get attention. That's all I do it for. And I suppose that there are many youth like that in the Church of God that really are seeking for attention in God's church. Now that leads me to what I have to say as well to the parents of God's church. You as a parent, without knowing it, can build into your sons and your daughters insecurity. You can build into them deep-rooted inferiority complexes. Now, how many of you here probably could think of a problem that you have that evolved from the family relationship? Maybe an inferiority that you may have. I don't know. I don't know your life. I know my life. I know some of the inferiorities and the problems I may have, but I can tell you that every last one of you who are parents and members and adults in God's church, you have a problem that evolved from your family by the instruction that either your father and your mother did not give, or instruction even that your father and your mother did give that was maybe not right. You know, there are two ways to learn. There's a positive way and there's a negative way. I'm going to give you an example about this, how you can build inferiority complexes into young people, because it's very simple. It doesn't take much to do that. Like, for instance, there's a man in a shop. He's working on his maybe chest or of drawers or something like that in his shop. He's a woodworker. And the son maybe is teenage. He comes home. He goes out to see his dad. He says, "Hey, Dad," he says, "what you doing?" He says, "Get out of here and leave me alone." What do you think that's going to do for that little boy? Going to build a real giant of a man? I don't think so. On the other hand, what if that same boy comes into the shop? He says, "Hey, Dad, what are you doing?" And he says, "Well, son, here, sit down a little while. Let's talk about what you did in school today, and then we can get into that and answer your questions." How many times do kids ask question after question after question? Now, somewhere in the cycle, Parents apparently react in a negative way because somewhere in the cycle people stop asking questions. And, you cannot learn unless you ask questions. You really can't. And so there has to be that positive instruction. And so, brethren, we need to give that to our young people. How you answer your son or your daughter makes all the difference in the world. It really does. Just a small thing. I had an experience just the other day, with a young person, and just a small thing, I could see the tears that were there. I could see the tears right there. Just a small thing. I won't tell you what it was because I don't reveal what I'm talking about so much, but it would take my word, it was a small thing. And it was right there. The problem was right there. And again, we can do it so easy. And how you answer makes all the difference in the world. I want you to notice also, with reference to young people, over in Romans the 12th chapter. Romans the 12th chapter in verse 15. How do you know your young people, your children, your sons, your daughters? And even if you say, well, I know them, you can know them better. Romans the 12th chapter, verse 15. It says, rejoice with them that do rejoice. Have you ever had someone that came up to you and is real happy and exuberant and everything like that, and they're coming up to you and they're trying to get you excited, and you kind of stand there and you say, what are you excited about? What are you excited about? Or maybe you pass someone in a bus station and a lady's sitting there crying. What do? Kneel down beside her and start, crying? Say, boo-hoo-hoo. Now, what was wrong? You don't cry and you don't laugh with people if you don't understand what they're saying, do you? You don't understand them, it's hard to laugh with them. Now, some people have a different sense of humor, really. Now, I think that it's interesting where, you can go to different parts of the world, and a joke that may be funny in England may not be funny here. And a joke that may be funny here may not be over there, because there are differences of humor in the world. There are differences of humor right here. It's like this fellow that moved into a community where they knew all the jokes, they're so well. Some people know jokes, I guess, so well, but in this community, particularly a party of people, they knew the jokes so well that they had them numbered. It's like number 10, number 9, number 8, and so forth. And so this fellow moves into the community, and he says, well, that should be easy just to, memorize which number, and so forth. And if I ever want to tell a joke, then all I do is shout out the number 7, number 6, whatever. And so he went over to a party in that community, and people were shouting out numbers. And somebody said, number 3! And everybody just rolled in the aisles. And somebody shouted, hey, number 5! And it just killed everybody. They could not even get their breath. And so this fellow was kind of working himself up. And he says, I want to use number 7 because that's a good one. And so he says, number 7! Complete silence. And somebody says, some people just don't know how to tell a joke. So there are different senses of humor, I guess you would say. And you can't rejoice with someone, and the point of the matter is you can't rejoice with someone unless you understand them. You have got to understand them. It's hard to weep with your children if you don't understand them. And brethren, you have got to understand your children. Do you only have shallow talks with your teens, with your children? Not really getting too personal or too intimate. Because you see, long, deep, heavy, and personal talks are the most impressionable talks and the most long-lasting ones that can really mean something to a young person. You've got the perfect atmosphere down here in St. Petersburg, Florida, to take your son or your daughter on a walk and say, hey, I want to talk to you about what you're going to do. Let's talk about it. What's on your mind? And maybe even, introduce something to talk about and try to glean from them what is in their mind. You can almost kind of pick their mind. There are people you can pick their mind as to what they're thinking. You can do the same thing with your children. And again, share. Giving and sharing Because the long, deep, heavy, and personal talks are the ones that make all the difference in the world for your children. And I think that you need to remember that the children are the product of your life in more ways than one. Because you will get out of your children what you instill in them. And you are commanded to put God's way in them. That's what God commands you to do over in Ephesians, the 6th chapter. Over in Ephesians 6 and verse 4, this is what the Apostle Paul spoke to the church of God nearly 2,000 years ago with reference to children. You know, the youth movement, by the way, in God's church, the Apostle Paul was dealing with even back in that time, by the way, as God is beginning to do it right now this time. It says in verse 4 to the fathers, again, notice the fathers. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. So you're not to provoke them to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So God commands you to train your children, to point the right way. You know, I have known of cases where people said, well, I want my son or my daughter to make their own decisions. You know, maybe he's 8 years old. You know, what does an 8-year-old know? What does a 12-year-old know? You know, and I don't mean to say that children of that age do not know anything. I'm just saying that there is a limitation as to what they know, and what they know is what you put in their minds up to that particular point. And so, you know, you're to help them grow to the point that when they are ready to leave the home, they can make the right decision. And you know that they will make the right decision. So point the right way. Well, before I start speaking directly to the young people, I've got one more question for you parents and members of God's church. What do you think goes through the mind of your children when you compromise God's law? Whether we're talking about God's holy days or the Sabbath, or maybe just laying out. Some of you have probably seen the television program where the advertisement, the father is correcting his son for not being honest. And then dad says, well, I think I'll call in sick tomorrow and stay home. What do you think your children think? I guess somehow we think that children don't have minds, that they can't comprehend, that they cannot reason. And so, brethren, it goes. That is the way people think. And don't think they don't know, because they do know. And I know what I'm talking about. Because when I was about 15 years of age, I started thinking, you know, I want to find the true church. That's what I started thinking when I was 15 years old. Just out here in the world, most of you probably, again, that have grown up in the church, are probably thinking about the same way. But except you've been taught the right way, hopefully, in your life, and you know where the true church is. You don't have to dig it out. You don't have to beat your head against the wall. But I know what your mind can be like, because I remember what mine was like. And what I was looking for was the true church. And so God has given you, brethren, the responsibility to help your children grow to the point where they can make the proper decision, and so that when they get mature, when they are mature, then they can make the proper decision to be a part of God's church. And God has left them a wide open door to be called. He just left a wide open door for them. And you can affect the future of your child so positively. And Christ says that you ought to. And of course He makes warnings as well about people that do not consider their children. Just let them float aimlessly, again, making their own decisions and making wrong decisions at that. Over in Matthew the 18th chapter, Jesus said this. In Matthew the 18th chapter in verse 6, let's apply it to the young people of God's church and how important it is of a responsibility to do what we're supposed to do with regard to young people. It says in verse 6, but whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were tied about his neck or hanged about his neck, and that he be drowned in the depths of the sea. So it's an important responsibility. Now God has opened that door just wide open for them. And parents, we have got to make sure that we do our part to point them toward the door, so to speak. Because it's a promise of God that He's going to keep that door open to call them when they mature. So be very careful. Now this leads me to the crux of the subject about young people. You know, young people, we are all have a street that's named after us. You know, probably you've gone and seen some of the sites, Grant's Tomb, or Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial. You know, they have streets that are named after people. You know, all of us, I guess, in one sense of the word, have a street that is named after us. And of course, you pass it probably quite a bit during the day if you're driving. And that street is one way. One way. Because you see, one way means you've got your own thing to do, and it's one way of thinking. And that one way is your way, or our way of thinking, in other words. And you know, having only one way to think is pretty dangerous sometimes. It can be really, really dangerous. And so we need to have the realization that life is not a one-way street. It is a two-way street. And yet society accentuates the one-way street, the one way of thinking, of doing my own thing. You know, it's so amazing to me that people want to do their own thing in the world. And, like little puppy dogs, we follow along after Satan and what Satan is doing. The world is fabricated. It is stereotyped. And in an effort to do their own thing, to be an individual, they're just like everybody else. You know, like yellow pencils. Everybody just doing their own thing, and they're just like each other. So society says, be an individual. Break away from the crowd. Be uniquely different, is what society is saying. Or do your own thing. You know, even the middle-aged are beginning to embrace that philosophy of doing your own thing. Interesting, isn't it? You've heard of the man that's 40 going on 16. You know, that when he gets 40 years of age, he maybe drops a little bit of weight, buys a toupee, and gets a sports car. I think there was a song about that. Mr. Scriber was talking about people who are 60 claiming that they're middle-aged the other day. And I heard a man explain that. Somebody was saying, you know, I'm 60, I'm middle-aged. And the fellow that was, I think, interviewing him says, you're 60 and you're middle-aged? He says, how many people do you know that are 120? You know, that really explains it. But that's the way, again, people are. They're beginning to do their own thing. They kind of want to break away from society and do their own thing, so to speak. But young people, do you realize the far-reaching effects of doing your own thing? You know, we oftentimes say, well, you know, I'm not hurting anybody if I do my own thing. You know, if I stay away from other people and I do my own thing, then I'm not hurting anyone. But you are hurting someone. You are hurting someone, brethren, young people. Well, who are you hurting? Ecclesiastes, the 11th chapter. Ecclesiastes, the 11th chapter. Solomon's wisdom says this, and I guess if anything could be said to young people, this would be a good thing to say. He says, O young man or girl, rejoice in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. You know, you have a good time. You enjoy yourself. You know, you get out on the disco floor and you enjoy yourself. You go to the beach and you enjoy yourself. You do what you want to do to enjoy yourself. But it says here, to walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But you know this, that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Now, not the good things, by the way. You know, God will judge you for the good, but, you know, the bad that you do, God is going to judge you for. You are responsible, young people. So who do you hurt? You hurt you. You hurt you. Over in Ezekiel, the 18th chapter, there was a popular proverb that was apparently going around in Israel. And people said it very, very often, I guess. And it says, the word of the Lord came unto me again, saying, in verse 1, verse 2, what mean you that you use this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, And the children's teeth are set on edge. You've heard people that say, well, the reason why I have all these problems is Dad did it. Mom did it. It's kind of a new version, I guess you'd say, of the devil made me do it. But Dad made me do it. Because, you see, it's my background. People would use that kind of a proverb for that. He says, as I live, says the Lord God, you shall not have occasion anymore to use this proverb in Israel. I guess God got absolutely sick of the way that people thought. And God says this to young people in verse 40, or verse 20. The soul that sins, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father. Neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him. And it continues, the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. You will be responsible for you. And so you hurt you. So you cannot do your own thing and say, I don't hurt anybody. Not only do you hurt yourself, but whether you realize it or not, you hurt and you affect every person you come in contact with to a lesser or greater degree. Over in Romans, the 14th chapter, Paul put it this way. Romans, the 14th chapter, verse 7. Paul says this about life. He says, for none of us. Now people say, well, I'm not hurting anyone. I'm kind of separate from everybody else. None of us lives or dies to himself. Ernest Hemingway's book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, expresses the same thing in a poem that was written by John Donne, because people would hear a bell that was tolling, and they would turn and say, well, for whom does the bell toll? You ever wonder why people ring the bells when people die? A particularly important person? For whom does the bell toll? Is it for the dead person? Well, no, the dead can't hear anything, but for the living. That is why the bell tolls. John Donne says this in a poem he wrote, For Whom the Bell Tolls. No man is an island, entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And if a clod be washed away by sea, Europe is less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of your friends or of your own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. This is what John Donne said in the book, For Whom the Bell Tolls. It tolls for thee. You affect everyone you come in contact with. You have a powerful and a direct effect on each person you come in contact with, young people, especially your friends. And you are responsible for that impact that you have upon those friends. But I don't want to affect or talk about the effect that you have on your friends. I want to talk about the dramatic effect that you have on your dad and your mom, both physically and mentally, both spiritually and psychologically. Sure, you may say, well, Dad and Mom really don't care at all, and it doesn't make any difference whether I do right or wrong, because you see, if I do good, either nothing is said, or maybe they praise me a little, but that's only sometimes. Or if I do wrong, then I get yelled at. But remember, I get the attention. They start looking at me. That's some of the reason I think that sometimes young people go through. But young people, when the yelling, when the discipline is over, you may forget the whole thing. Oftentimes young people may not remember it all that long, but the parents don't. They continue to remember it. And it still eats away inside of them, in the mind of your mother and your father. They simply don't forget about it. When you have a shame, young people, it's not just your shame. Maybe you've done something wrong and shamed the family name. It's not just your shame. It is a shame that comes upon your father and your mother, your parents as well. I remember when something happened in my town. I grew up in a little town called Roland, Oklahoma. I remember when something happened in that town. It was small, and it was as though, I guess, the walls had ears, because basically anything that happened, everybody in the world knew about it. It wasn't Jim Tuck did this. It was Lawson Tuck's boy who did that. I remember it. The way that my friends would talk about how their parents would talk about me. Of course, I won't tell you some of the things I did when I was growing up, because I won't embarrass myself at this point. But it was not my shame. It was my dad's shame, my parents' shame. And you can, brethren, young people, you can help build and you can help determine the image and the respect of your father. You really can. Because you represent your father and your mother. And this is no small deal. You can and are, in many cases, responsible for the mental torment that your parents go through. You know, I am responsible myself, I know, for many hairs that fell to the ground for my father. I know also the sore backs that my dad had. You know, when I came back from Ambassador College, I discovered those things because Dad started telling me about some of the shenanigans that I got him into and so forth. And I learned a lot more, too. I found how much my dad and mom knew. It's like old Mark Twain said. He said, you know, when I was 16, my father was dumb. But he said, 5 years later, when I returned home at 21, I was amazed at how much my father had learned. And, you know, I learned that myself when I came back from Ambassador College. Now, another thing. Young people don't always expect perfect judgment and perfect discipline from your parents. Don't expect it. You will not get perfect judgment and perfect discipline because your parents are not perfect. I know that you teens know that by now. Of course, when the little kids are, 5 or so, or 4 or so, they say, well, Daddy never makes a mistake. But of course, when you grow older, you begin to realize that they are not perfect. So don't expect perfect judgment and perfect discipline. This generation of young people is not an easy generation to entreat or to deal with in God's church or either in the world for that matter. Because we live in a peculiar age of youth. This generation, I think, could be labeled a tender generation. Because they are not easily corrected. They are easy to hurt and to wound, but very slow to heal. And it's sadly true. It's the generation that we live in. And so youth, it's hard to really appreciate the good parents that you have. You know, we really, even as young people, don't know how good it is until the time has come when it's too late. There was a true story about a boy named John who was kind of a rowdy. He was a rebel. And maybe we have a John or two in the audience. I don't know. I'm sure we do. But John was a rebel. If anything happened at school, he could just about bank that he was going to be involved in it. Whether we're talking about, tearing down the dispensers in the bathroom, or, throwing spit wads in the classroom, or beating up on somebody. John was involved. And his parents were really wasted away by the way that John was. He was a rebel. He was a troublemaker. Well, John also, one day, decided he and his friend Bill were going to go boar hunting. If you've ever been boar hunting, it's, again, a very rough sport, so to speak. And so he went hunting way back in the Tuliwads, I guess you'd say, in the forest and so forth. And he returned, he and Bill, to the pickup where they had left off to go hunting. And John put a shotgun against the side of his pickup. And he went over, and as he went over to the back of the pickup, the shotgun slid down the side of the pickup and discharged. It went off. And John actually caught it right in the abdominal region. He was way back from a long way from his doctor or from his parents. And so Bill held him in his arms for almost 20 minutes as John agonized. And he had a lot of things to say. And he thought about his parents. And before he died, John said this. He says, I know that I've caused them a lot of problems, but tell them I love them. Tell them I love them. Young people, we really underestimate our power to make and break our parents. And usually we don't understand that. We don't comprehend that until it's too late. You know, we've talked about how you can break them. But do you realize, young people, how you can inspire your parents? You can make them feel proud that you are their children. You do inspire, to a large degree, even if you are rebellious, I guess, your grandparents. You know, I know that when little Sean David was born, my father and mother were so proud, so very proud. Now, it was the 16th grandchild, but they were still proud. They were still proud. So you inspire your grandparents and your parents, and they look for the best in you. And parents like to be proud of their sons and daughters. And one of the greatest feelings, I guess, in the world is to know that mom and dad are pleased with you. Now, there was a period of time in my life before I went off to Ambassador College, and I guess as Mr. McNair was talking about Ambassador College, it made me think back, you know, when I went off to Ambassador College, my parents didn't want me to go to Ambassador College. And so Ambassador is different in the fact that what students ever go to any other university against their parents' will? I went to Ambassador College against my parents' will, and they were not pleased with what I did. And so for a good while, they just really were very displeased with me. So I know what it feels like to be out of favor, I suppose you'd say, with the parents. Now, of course, I'm back into favor, hopefully. And at any rate, when they hear this sermon, maybe they will not feel that way, but I think that they will. They'll understand what I'm saying. But you do not have the same feeling, you know, when they feel so much towards you. They're proud of you. And again, if you've ever lacked it, you know what I'm saying. The greatest desire that your parents have, young people, is to see you in God's kingdom. To see you mature. And to make the correct decisions in life on your own. And to see you walk through the door that has been opened by God. And it's going to be opened to you to the point where when you mature, you can make the right decision and become a part of God's church. They look to that time to see you to decide on your own the Christian way of life of God's church. And to not see you really bludgeon and beat your head against the brick wall and have to go through the University of Hard Knocks. They desire that. To see you be a part of the body of Jesus Christ. To make it. To be there. And not have to do it the way that maybe some of them did. Some of your parents probably could tell you some tales about their lives. Some were called maybe when they were 30. Some were called in their 20s, very early. Some were called in their 40s. But every step along the way, they had to beat their heads, so to speak, against the brick wall of society and learn the hard knocks. And they don't want you to go through that. They don't want you to experience that. Young people, take what God's church has to offer now. Get on the ground floor. God has offered you something on the ground floor. And He wants you to take it very early in your life and not beat your head against, again, the brick wall of society. Over in Proverbs, the 8th chapter. Proverbs 8. It says in verse 17, I love them that love me. Young people, you need to grow in your relationship with God every single day. Be like a David. I know that some of you do take walks every once in a while. And I know that you also think about God on those walks, probably. Take a lot more walks. Think about your relationship with God. And grow in that relationship that you have with God. But He says, I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. If you want to, again, be a part of God's church, when you mature, when you've gone through, again, the growing up years, the door's wide open. God says you're going to find it. And again, there are a lot of people that are looking for God out there. 4.5 billion people are looking for God. And not one of them has found God. Some reason, young people, God has chosen to call your parents. I guess it's for some indescribable reason, and I'm speaking about the kingdom of God, that God's going to use them in the kingdom of God. And you happen to be the children of those people that were called. And God wants you to have a part in that. He's kind of left the door wide open. He's put you in a separate category that no other person in the entire world is in. Has God called us, brethren, young people, to be the same as the rest of the world? Because you see, if He's called us to be the same as the rest of the world, why doesn't He call the other 4.5 billion people? Because if He does not expect you to be different than any other group of young people on the face of the earth, or any other parents on the face of the earth, then why has He said that He is not a respecter of persons? God expects you, parents and young people, to be different, to be a different kind of people, to really set a good example with regard to family life. Young people seek God now while He may be found. And God has again opened that door to you. And you can make the right decision. And you can be there, young people. And you can, we don't know how much time we've got, you can walk shoulder to shoulder with your parents. You can walk arm in arm into the kingdom of God as a family and as a team to have a happy and a productive and a joyous way of life. And you won't see all this problem out here in the world because God is going to just wipe that away. And so you got that opportunity. And I'm not saying that it's going to be easy for the parents or the children. I'm saying you can. You can, parents. Be the kind of parents that you ought to be. You can, young people. Challenge the world, so to speak. And be uniquely different from the rest of the world, if you so choose to be. And believe me, if you walk according to God's way, you are going to be an individual. Because you're going to be like God, and God certainly is not like the rest of the world, by the way. But you know, it's not going to be easy, but then again, anything and everything that is worthwhile in life isn't easy to attain, is it? It's going to involve some teamwork, parents and young people. Some sacrifice, in other words. Not each person doing his own thing, so to speak, but working together for the whole, maybe forgetting about yourself for a while, and working for the family, the whole, the body of Jesus Christ. But teamwork is very, very important. To apply that teamwork. Vince Lombardi is long ago died. Very profound, I think, educator, as well as very much involved in sports. All of you probably have heard about him. Maybe even heard some of the things he said. But he gave this a month before he died. It's on the subject of success. He was speaking to a group of businessmen in Washington. He says, I want to say first that I think you've got to pay a price for anything that's worthwhile, and success is paying the price. You want a good family, you're going to have to pay the price. We want a family-oriented church, and God is commanding us to be a family-oriented church. We're going to have to pay the price. You've got to pay a price to win. You've got to pay a price to stay on top. You've got to pay a price to get there. Success is not a sometime thing. It's an all-the-time thing. In other words, you don't do what is right once in a while, but all the time. Success is a habit. Being a family of God is a habit. Growing into a habit. Becoming an individual that emphasizes this character in his family. He says, just like winning is a habit. He says, I believe that man's greatest hour, in fact, his greatest fulfillment, his finest hour, is that moment when he has worked his heart out, and for a good cause. And brethren, the family is a good cause. The body of Jesus Christ, again, as a family growing the way that Jesus Christ wants us to. He says, in fact, the greatest fulfillment, his finest hour, is the moment when he has worked his heart out for a good cause and lies exhausted but victorious on the field of battle, whenever and wherever that field of battle may be. Right now, in the large sense, I think we're engaged in a struggle which is far more fiercely contested than anything. And it's a struggle for the hearts, and it's a struggle for the minds of us all. And Satan has told us again, and we realize that Satan tells us that because society beams that out every single day, that Satan wants to destroy the family. He wants to destroy the fathers and the mothers. You know, he wants men to kind of shrivel up and die, I guess you'd say, and not be men. He wants wives, again, to forsake the home. And again, I know that there are reasons for a wife to work, but if you don't have to, then don't. He wants children to forsake their parents. So this is one of the biggest contests, I guess you would say, that man has ever contested. This church is going to have to come to that realization about the importance of the family. He says it's a game in which there are no spectators, only players. And there's a struggle which is going to test all of our courage and all of our stamina and all of our teamwork. It's a game in which the only true satisfaction a man receives is the satisfaction which he gets from being a part of the successful whole, regardless of what his particular success is. Just as you, regardless of what you sow as an individual in your company, can never be truly satisfied unless your company is also successful. Talk to some of the ladies here that do not have their mates in God's church, and you realize them being a success is not as satisfying as it would be for a husband and wife team being a success, for a family being a success. So family is a teamwork, brethren, and that's what it's all about. This is what this church is all about, building the family. This is what this feast is all about as well, the family relationship in the kingdom of God. And we need to work on our families, brethren, in a way that we never have before. And we need teamwork involved with it. Over in Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter. Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter. Here God is inspired to put in verse 1 through verse 6 something about the family. It says, "Now these are the commandments, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord your God commanded to teach you, that you might do them in the land whither you go to possess it." You know, I find that oftentimes if God doesn't command you to do something, chances are you won't do it. He says, "I command you to do this, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all His statutes, His commandments, which I command you, you and your son, and your son's son, all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may increase mightily, as the Lord God of your fathers have promised you, in the land that flows with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one eternal, or one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your hearts." Is God's way of life in your heart? Because if it's in your heart, it's going to have to be done something with it. That truth is going to flow out of you. And then he says in verse 7, remember he commanded us. He said, "And you shall teach them diligently," not haphazardly, but diligently unto your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, and you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. It has got to be such a part of you, brethren, that you want to teach your children every single day. I don't know what you're like, but myself, because I guess I'm a minister, have on my mind pretty much, I guess, all the time. I think all the ministers of God's church do what is happening in the church. You ought to be that way too. But you ought to have God's law kind of active in your heart, in your mind, in your being. So much so it says that you're willing to teach them to your children. Parents, take a walk with your children along the beach. Tell them about God. Tell them about what this is all about. What God is doing in His church today. And what they're going to be doing in the world tomorrow. Tell them about that. Don't hide it from their eyes, but tell them about it. Our young people really do want to know. They want to know. They want to know what their part is in God's kingdom. They want to know more and more about God's truth. I love Mr. Herbert Armstrong's attitude toward the young people when he made a statement in one of his tapes. He says, you know, I'm going after the little guys. I love that attitude. And of course, I think you understand what Mr. Armstrong means by that. We have a tremendous program in the church today, brethren. But we have got to do it sometime, and the time is now. We can't wait 15 or 20 years before our families become the families of God that they ought to be. The time is now. Spend time with your families. Speak to your children, parents. And children, listen to your parents. Little kids, teenagers, all the way up the scale. Listen to your parents. Listen to the ministers of God's church. They can keep you from banging your head against the wall, and again, we don't want to see that happen to you. We don't want to see that at all. And brethren, if we cannot rule and smoothly conduct our families of God's church, how could we ever rule in the kingdom of God? How could we? If you fathers cannot take the role in the family, how can we rule in the kingdom of God? So we need to work on that right now, today. And it's time to stop making excuses the way the world makes excuses. They say, well, you know, I'm going to do it sometime in the future. I just got to do this and I've just got to do that. All kinds of excuses. We have been called, brethren, in this generation of Christians to break the vicious cycle of the destruction of the family and to revitalize the Christian family in a way that has never been revitalized before. Families of God going in the right direction. And so what I say to you, brethren, is let's not think to ourselves, we'll have a good time then, as the song goes. But let's think to ourselves, let's spend the time together now while we have time.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.